Welcome to the third event of the Tout Va Bien Series this year by Går Bra. And especially welcome to our two guests today, the philosophers Ruda and Agon Hamza. So Går Bra started the Tout Va Bien series in 2015 here at Kunsthall, Landmark. And we've been inviting international guests, some artists, some scholars, to discuss about intersections of art and politics. So previous guests we have had in the series is the art group Slogans, the art group Neue Slowenische Kunst, the artist Thomas Hirschon, the philosopher Chantal Mouffe, curatorial duo Public Monk, the philosopher Jacques Rancière, and the last event we had was with the art duo Kumar and Melamid. So we want to say thank you to Kunsthall and Landmark for hosting this series, and also to say thank you to our sponsors, which are Fritt Ord, Norsk Kulturråd, and Bergen Kommune. And now my colleague from Går Bra will introduce more thoroughly our guests today.
Thank you. So before I go into a brief introduction of Agon Hamza and Ruda, I want to read a text that somehow should introduce their work. And this text comes from a project that we are working on that is called Den Norske Idealstaten, that can be translated into English as the Norwegian Republic, that consists in rewriting Plato's Republic. As it has been often noticed, Plato's book, The Republic, starts by a word that seems to never be emphasized enough. The word in Greek is kateben. This word, kateben, can be translated as I went down, I descended. This descent refers to the dramatic setting of the Republic, that descent of Socrates, descending from the city of Athens down to the city port, the Piraeus. This kateben, the descent, recalls the allegory of the cave that Plato will elaborate later on in the Republic. Plato's cave holds the human genre captured in a world of blindness and injustice. The enslavement inside the cave, just as the liberation from it, entirely depends on human action. In the allegory of the cave, human action is solely responsible for having generated the enslavement, and it is only human action that can remediate it. This kateben refers to three descents. One is the descent of the philosopher to the cave to free the human genre from darkness and injustice. The other descent refers to the dramatic setting for the Republic, with Socrates descending from the port. And the third descent is that of Socrates' actual descent into Hades, which is the Greek name for the underworld, the final residence of the dead. This last descent refers to the ultimate sacrifice of the philosopher. It refers to Socrates giving up his own life. It refers to the Athenian democracy democratically resolving to sentence Socrates to death. Socrates' death closes the circle of descents. his death serving as direct inspiration for Plato to ask in the Republic what would happen if someone descended to the cave wanting to bring the prisoners out to the light. What would the prisoners do to that person who wanted to liberate them from the cave? Plato says, and if it were possible to lay hands on and to kill the man who tried to release them and lead them up, would they not kill him? Would the prisoners not kill the man who was trying to liberate them from the cave and bring them up to life, to the light? And the response to the question is, they certainly would. They would kill that person who wanted to free them. So now I will briefly introduce our two guests. In the lineage of Slavoj Žižek in the Ljubljana school, Ruda and Hamza, Frank Ruda and Agon Hamza, have elaborated a body of philosophical work that is concerned with politics, but also with aesthetics. Some publications in the field of aesthetics include Agon Hamza's book entitled Althusser and Pasolini, and Frank Ruda's volume Art and Contemporaneity. Ruda and Hamza have collaborated in several projects, including the co-editing of the journal Crisis and Critique, which is concerned with conceptualizing a mode of critique able to overcome the current impasse in critical thought. Fatalism and freedom are central concepts in Frank Ruda's thought. Fatalism is not a solution, but a proposal for a political attitude, consisting in what Ruda says, I'm quoting him, it consists in an affirmation of the impossibility of life, politics, and art, which may generate the preconditions for a new thinkability, an impossible possibility of life, politics, and art. Ruda challenges certain contemporary conceptualizations of freedom, where freedom rather becomes a synonym of oppression. According to Ruda, freedom is not a capacity or a possession we are born with, but conversely, something to be attained that we may never actually reach. Along with Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou, Agon Hamza is a proponent of the idea of communism, which he defines as the historical endeavors and struggles for universal emancipation. Religion is central to Hamza's idea of communism, conceiving Christianity as a condition for emancipatory movements like Marxism and communism. In his book Althusser and Pasolini, Hamza draws parallels between the French philosopher and the Italian filmmaker and poet, concluding by saying that Catholicism is a fundamental component not only of Pasolini's but also of Althusser's work. And to conclude, I will refer to the work that they have done in common. They have other publications that are quite a few that they have published individually. So they have co-edited the journal Crisis and Critique that I mentioned before since 2011. And they have also co-authored a book called Slavoj Žižek and Dialectical Materialism. And they are currently working on a book called Reading Marx, which is co-authored with Slavoj Žižek. So thank you very much, and I'll pass the word to you.
Thank you.
So yeah, as usual, they will talk like one person and then the other one, and then we'll have a Q&A. So they have independent, separate talks, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Okay, thanks so much for, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, so thanks so much for the invitation and the kind words of introduction. That was a spoiler. First I'm going to start, and then he's going to present his paper, and then, I don't know, you can express your disappointment in what we have been saying. Okay. There are moments in the lives of a human being in which it speaks in a very peculiar manner. In a manner that at first sight, at least, seems to contradict the famous Wittgensteinian argument about the impossibility of a private language, which was also earlier formulated, as is lesser known, by Karl Marx in his Grundrisse, who stated that, I quote briefly, as regards the individual, it is clear, i.g., that he relates even to language itself as his own only as the natural member of a human community. Language as the product of an individual is an impossibility. Language itself is the product of a community, unquote. For Marx, as well as for Wittgenstein, a private language was an impossibility because on the one side, all language exists before the individual and hence is determined by historically varying social collective practices that exceed any individual grasp. On the other, it is impossible because a private and merely individual language would be entirely unintelligible to everyone else and thus would lose its very ontological status as language. If only I do speak a language but no one else, this language cannot be properly called a language anymore. Yet there are moments, as I said a moment ago, in the life of human beings where they seem to be doing the impossible. They seem to create their own language and at the same time separate it, cut it off, and liberate it not only from its objective references, but even from the dimension of meaning and thereby from its comprehensibility to others, or by others, sorry. To not leave these remarks in the state of mere abstract reflection, just think of how people talk to each other who are in love. The language they use interacting with each other, at least certainly some parts of it, appears to those that are not part of the love scenario, to the onlookers, as it were, often as meaningless, as devoid of sense, as childish and infantile, as peculiarly self-contained and self-enclosed, maybe even self-immunizing. This is because it is indifferent not only to the world and to others, but also to the standard communicative ways of language usage. It is as if it replaces references to objective meaning by something like a subjective opposite of meaning. One might say instead of knowledge, articulation, and meaning, standard Habermas, we here get a subjective articulation of truth. Language does no longer serve as a tool for objective meaning and knowledge production and communication, but rather as something like an expression of or articulation of subjective truths that is peculiarly indifferent to communication. To the onlookers, observers, the language usage of the couple may thus appear as if they were engaged in a practice of l'art pour l'art, parler pour en parler, of l'amour pour l'amour, as it were, or even of le langue de l'amour pour le langue de l'amour, to modify a famous book title of Jean-Claude Milner. People in love make a different use of language, a peculiar misuse, as it were. Maybe even they abuse it. Such abuse of language by abolishing any constitutive relation to meaning and communication with others that are not already involved in this practice. Such a language use literally makes no sense to the uninvolved others, as if it were a foreign language, only that it isn't. This abuse of language indicates an other use of language, one that seems to express or even enable, articulate, as well as produce a peculiar kind of pleasure, a kind of enjoyment, and the enjoyment of talking about it, of talking about the practice one is engaged in as a part of this practice itself, a talking practice. This enjoyment of talking meaningless things obviously pertains only to the participants of this very language practice, only to the childishly amorous who are speaking as if in tongues, and at least at times endlessly circle and circulate in language only around themselves and their shared origins. This language of love for love's sake is not an entirely new language, as I said before, but rather a different use that subtracts language from sense production, and at least partially seems to repeatedly articulate in ever new, but sometimes in just the same old ways, the fact that its speakers are in love. It is as if language is subtracted from meaning by just being stuck on a repeated affirmation of being in love, endlessly referring to common experiences. Just think of couple who always, again, like children, refer to their common stories, right? I mean, you remember that one time we did the following thing? Something like that, right? There is something like a repetition indifference in language in these practices, a sort of regressive, childish, yet collective usage of language. And I think the infantility of it is not accidental. A regression, as it were, to a non-objective, private level, which is linked to or expresses, or both, the peculiar enjoyment, a kind of surplus enjoyment that springs from participating in such meaningless collective abuse of language, and that, and this point is important, might occur nonetheless in everyone's life. I mean, all of you might fall in love if you're not already in love. It is thus not a language of elites, right? It's a language which is private but has a weird universal dimension. Yet what might seem, at least to external observers, to be simply a regressive practice also has a peculiar productive and creative aspect. Just think of practices like inventing new names, pet names, for the beloved one. Even the English expression pet name is telling, as if there were involved what Deleuze and Guattari called a becoming minoritarian of language. These names are clearly not objective descriptions. If one calls one's loved one sweetie, baby, honeybee, or more creative names, these are obviously descriptively wrong, or only in some rare and slightly illegal cases they're not. In such a language use, there is a kind of genuine linguistic inventiveness and creativity at work, a practice of renaming, a practice of symbolic redetermination. It is important to note the obvious. This kind of language practice emerges in a historically specific context. It emerges in the life of these two individuals that form a couple. Since one is not always, but one falls in love with a specific person in a specific situation. And such a fall engenders what appears to be a peculiar infantile abuse or language use, a genuinely subjective language practice, as it is the practice of a subject, namely of the couple in love. That again is a subject that did not always already exist, but came into being as a result of something happening to the individuals that formed that very couple. Right? They had to meet and then start talking about their meeting and what they're doing. This kind of language use is thus linked to the emergence of a novelty which also renews language practice, as it were. Such novelty is thus only properly comprehensible, I think, from within the immanence of such a practice. It only makes sense to its participants. This is why it can appear that here a privatization of language is implied, even though essentially any couple consists of a minimal collective, at least two, right? It seems to manifest not only a privacy, a privateness, a privation of language and language use, but also of its universal dimension. But not only, as I emphasized before, can this happen to potentially every human being. It is a shared singularity. It points to what Badiou once called a community of singularities. Or, in different terms, Georg Simmel once called that a fluid universal. As everyone in love makes an absolutely singular experience, which it shares, the individual, with all other individuals who made this singular experience of being in love. Right? I mean, there's a universality pertaining to this. And obviously, this kind of practice generates objective consequences. People buy actual pets or move in together and so forth, right? I mean, it changes their individual world. So why begin a lecture, which officially is on Lenin, with a reference to the peculiar language practice of couples in love? I mean, that's because, I mean, I give you the answer, because it seems to be that some features that are constitutive of the language practice of a couple in love bear certain structural similarities to other forms of practices. Think of claims linked to or inaugurating scientific revolutions, for example. They occur, as Foucault demonstrated in his infamous Archaeology of Knowledge, within a historically specific episteme in an organized realm of knowledge that determines what counts as meaningful enunciation, and therein they make no sense. Either they then themselves induce a transformation of that very episteme, or if it originates independently from them, they are post facto regarded as meaningful propositions. So some scientific statements make no sense in a certain period of time, and then things change, and then one can claim, wow, this anticipated Galileo, or whatsoever. One may also think of certain transformations in art. One does not even need to refer to the invention of new forms of art, like cinema ages ago. They do often not amount to a discrete modulation or alteration of the existent forms of artistic practice, but rather to a creation and invention of new forms, new practices of form production for that which previously did not receive a form. Think of Schönberg, but also Brecht and others. Just like to refer to a very conservative canon. Certain artistic collectives explicitly claim to be revolutionizing the very state of art, pun intended, wrote a manifesto, a declaration in a new kind of language. And is it not that such a declaration or manifesto also has something that stands at the ground of novelty in political practices that were once referred to, for example, as revolutionary? So is there not, that's what I'm suggesting, a similarity that even emancipatory politics has a language of its own? If radical transformation in collective practices like love, science, art, politics are manifestations of an exception to the law of the existing order, even to what this order deemed to be possible. So something happened which was not expected. You never expect to fall in love, right? I mean, it happens and then it makes your life miserable and then you try to cope with it afterwards. Well, right? I mean, so some kind of exception happens. So if that is an exception, these exceptions cannot but appear to be, in a sense, nonsensical or childish or whatever from the perspective of the situation to which these exceptions are exceptions, because they're exceptions. That's tautological, but nonetheless true. If radical transformations start from such an exception, an event, but you would call it, breaking up with the order of the day, and if this generates material effects, even on the use of language, this is what I'm suggesting, people in love speak differently, and produces a subjective, maybe subjectivized language, a language of exception, maybe an exceptional language, the question I want to address today, and this is why I started with this slightly romantic overtone. The question I want to address today is, how do these exceptional languages work? This is obviously too big of a question to satisfyingly answer in 30 minutes, and therefore I will doubly limit myself. Firstly, I will only refer to one specific form of collective practice, namely to politics, and I will secondly limit myself to one singular case, namely spoiler, to that of Lenin. But singular cases do not exclude, as I said before, their universalization. I take my cue from a remark by Daniel Bonsaïd, who once stated that emancipatory politics, I quote, has its own language, grammar, and syntax, unquote. So politics is a singular kind of discourse. And if the former analogy to the discourse of love can be upheld, this must mean that true politics does talk in a singular manner, hard to comprehend from the outside. Certainly, everyone can understand what Angela Merkel says, but maybe this does simply indicate that what we're listening to, if we're listening to her, is not really politics. So let me try to disentangle this conceptual tangle. Immanuel Kant claimed that it's not enough to abstractly assume a constant progress towards the better or worse in human history, but that, I quote, there must be, that's from the Conflict of Faculties, there must be some experience in the human race which, as an event, points to the disposition and capacity of the human race to be the cause of its own advance toward the better, unquote. Since it is impossible to empirically prove unambiguously any progression toward either the good or the bad, this is what Kant argued. I mean, either you're an optimist and then you're, I don't know, constantly good-mooded, or a pessimist and then you're not. But it's empirically impossible to prove that either hypothesis is correct. These events have to be taken and acquire the status of what Kant calls a historical sign. And he says in Latin, a signum memorativum demonstrativum prognosticum. Some events in the course of human history are more than mere objective occurrences. It's more than just like, I don't know, a tree falling or whatsoever. In short, there are events in human history that are, in a sense, punctuations in and of history from which one can draw a line, a vector, which points toward progress. And right now, that's Kant's argument. One should never forget, this is the signum memorativum, that mankind's future, this is the signum prognosticum, tends toward the better, and that this has been proven, this is the signum demonstrativum. Right? One should never forget that it has been proven that the future will be brighter. Kant's argument is that those events function as signs when they are inscribed into the framework of human history within which they receive their meaning, namely, they indicate progress. There is therefore an always already given meaning to the historical sign as historical sign. I mean, if there is a historical sign for Kant, it always signals progress. That's weird for a sign because there is only one sign then, right? Or one meaning to all the signs. Alain Badiou has quite harshly criticized this Kantian conception, inter alia because the Kantian conception relies on what symptomatically is expressed in Kant's definition of enthusiasm, an effect that Kant thought everyone would feel with regard to the French Revolution, a historical sign for Kant. Enthusiasm in Kant is defined as wishful participation, in German Beteiligung dem Wunsche nach. And for Badiou, this is a very problematic expression because even though this peculiar affect is induced by seeing the revolutionary events in France unfold, for Kant, it is solely felt, and this is literally Kant, by the observers who stand in a distance from the actual political happenings because they can reflect on what is actually happening. The others are too involved into participating in what happens. Yet, and this is Badiou's criticism, Kant's theory of the historical sign thereby proves peculiarly detached from the very practice it is supposed to be the sign of. In short, Kant's way of enthusiastically relating from a distance to the event of 1789 and judging them as signs of humanity's historical progress misses not only their specificity, but by only abstractly, in the sense of taking them as signs for the progress, right? They are just signaling progress, misses what truly happened. Kant, in his admiration for the French Revolution, misses the point, as it were. He misses the concrete and determined aspects of this process of self-determination. Simply put, Kant basically says, okay, there is true free self-determination happening in France, but weirdly, I determine what it will all be about, namely progress. Right? And that's a problem, sort of. Because then self-determination is not self-determination, it's all about progress already. That's a conceptual problem. Badiou's harsh criticism thus runs as follows. If one wants to understand what happened in the French Revolution, Kant does not help. I quote, "It is through Saint-Just and Robespierre that you enter into this singular truth unleashed by the French Revolution and on the basis of which you form a knowledge, and not through Kant or François Furet." Unquote. The only way not to misjudge by applying some external standard, such as the progress of human freedom, or evaluating its significance only from evaluating its outcomes, that would be François Furet. I mean, it ended in violence, therefore it is a violent event, hence a tragedy or whatever. The only way not to misjudge what happened in the French Revolution, that's Badiou's claim, is to judge the revolution from an immanent perspective, to take the position, whatever precisely that means, of Saint-Just and Robespierre, and not of Kant and Furet. Similar to the couple in love, one can only understand, that's Badiou's claim, I think, what happens in a revolutionary practice from taking the perspective of an active participant in that very practice, and not from the position of a passive observer. Badiou's point is to avoid the peculiar problem of the Kantian position, of applying an external standard, which in Kant's case refutes what Kant wanted to see. The only way of avoiding that is by not presupposing any criterion of evaluation that comes from outside these practices, but derive the evaluating criterion from within these practices. Right? See if they are true to their own standards that they apply. I want to add to Badiou's claim the following one. Kant's claim that the French Revolution is a historical sign is important, but it has to be elaborated in a fundamentally different way from the Kantian one. If there is something like a historical sign dimension of emancipatory political practices, it can only be grasped by assuming the subjective position of the very agent of these practices. Only by examining, as it were, the very sign use, the language use of the participants that they made themselves. To comprehend the dimension, so you only understand what the French revolutionaries meant by freedom if you take the position of Saint-Just. That's what I'm trying to say. To comprehend the dimension of such a practice as a historical sign does not work by reference to a trans-historical framework, but only from within, only from giving an account of the very specific usages and uses of signs, words, proposition, war cries, watchwords, slogans, etc. One is then no longer dealing with the sign endowed with an already given meaning, progress, Kant, but with a perspective that also takes into account the very constitution of historical signs in a specific historical conjuncture. Right? Freedom only in the context of the French Revolution, even though it might have a universal value. I'm not denying that. Kant is thus right. Certain practices can be understood and can maybe only be understood when read as historical signs. Yet with Badiou, I want to assert that it's not always already intelligible what these signs mean. Otherwise, they would, as historical signs, have an unhistorical essence. So what I want to examine is how a purely subjective significance of historical signs, of language use and practice, can be understood from within that nonetheless has a universal dimension. So tells us something. The question is thus, how does a subjective political language use work? Or to rephrase it, how does the revolution speak? So in the year of its centenary, I thought it's a good idea to turn to Lenin. I mean, century not of Lenin, but Russian Revolution, you know that. I want to begin with a simple observation. Nearly all of Lenin's texts are directly linked and bound with practical questions. The infamous Tagesfragen, he uses often the German term, the questions of the day, that is the specific historical conjuncture in which Lenin thought, wrote, and intervened. As Frederick Jameson once argued, Lenin always thinks politically, but he also always speaks politically. And this inter alia means polemically. He speaks to divide and demarcate positions. This holds even for his early and more theoretical writings, if one may say so, like Materialism and Imperial Criticism, of which I'm not a fan, but nonetheless, as Dominique Lecour has shown, wherein he is struggling with a certain scientific ideology, which is not simply theoretically problematic, but has an immediate impact on how the world and practices are perceived, that is, has certain practical implications. And of course, this holds for the famous what is to be done, a question that Lenin in 1917 modifies into how is it to be done? These practical issues do not only determine the content of what Lenin is saying and elaborating, and this is what I want to say, but also the way in which he says it. It's the mode of speaking, the mode of talk. Georg Lukács stated that Lenin expresses the key note with a slight dash, Grundton in German, the keynote of a whole epoch. And this is because he does not wait for the revolution to come, but already assumes it, that's Lukács again, as a fact. That is, he posits as presupposition of all his interventions that the revolution is unavoidable and necessary. Kind of fatalism, if you wish. It's a nodal point. Its nodal point, Knotenpunkt, that's Lukács again, is the proletariat. Punkt, the point is important for me, is the proletariat. It is the point in which all lines cross and from which all lines of Lenin's intervention diverge. The historical situation in which Lenin is active is thus already assigned, appointed, a punctualized situation. And the main point of reference is, I quote Lukács again, the class standpoint of the proletariat. One might say for Lenin holds that philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to get the point, to see how the historical situation is punctuated. Lenin's historical sign, that's my first proposal, is a point, a punctualization of history. If one gets the point, this is from where one unfolds one's own practical agenda. This means Lenin takes, as Lukács argues, the actuality of the revolution as a starting point, its subject, the proletariat, as the main subjective point of reference. Evaluating the situation from a different standpoint, therefore, and Lenin is very explicit, necessarily means to miss the concrete character of all his interventions. And just to lay my cards on the table, I'm not simply defending Lenin here, right? But I'm trying to figure out how his discourse, if you wish, works as a political discourse. I might be tempted to defend Lenin for a long period of time. Just maybe I should say that too, but that's all the way, I guess. Only from the point and standpoint of the proletariat one is able to see what he repeatedly called the historical and situational turning points. The jumping points, that's a shitty translation from German, sorry, for the punctum saliens, right? The historical situation in which Lenin intervenes. The points one needs to treat. Lenin's language is unfolding through these points. Lenin is connecting the dots. It is thus a pointed language. He always proceeds from one point, from one turning point to another turning point. Only by taking into account these constitutive punctuations of history, one can start comprehending the internal logic of Lenin's discourse, the discourse that Viktor Shklovsky called the language of revolution. I therefore take Lenin's discourse as a paradigm of how to conceive of a radically subjectivized and subjective language in politics, for as Tynyanov stated, such a revolutionary practice also had to imply, I quote Tynyanov, a revolution in the field of style, that is, language. The language of the revolution must entail a revolution in language. That's the claim. Not mine, not only mine. I'm therefore today not interested in Lenin's institution of a different kind, that's literally Lenin, namely the infamous dictatorship of the proletariat, but rather in what one might call Lenin's language of a different kind. So you see why there is an aesthetic dimension into this political action. That's what I'm, a weird way of saying this. And this must be a part of what Lenin stated in a note from his notebooks on Hegel's logic. He there writes, I quote, "Man's cognition does not reflect the world, it creates it." So man's cognition creates the world. Unquote. So Lenin's language practice must be part and parcel of the creation of the world into which it then immediately and with the very same act intervenes. Before more concretely examining its logic, one should note that in Lenin, subjectivized language does not imply that there is, as Althusser, for example, argued, class struggle in the domain of philosophy and theory, but also in language itself. Language itself becomes a battlefield. There is emancipatory, one might say, and reactionary ways of using it. There is thus no neutrality in language for Lenin. So that's super anti-Habermas. To specify this claim, there is no objective kind of rationality. That's what I'm trying to say in language use, right? To specify this claim, it is instructive to begin by examining the epitome of reactionary language use that Lenin throughout his oeuvre refers to as phrase. A phrase, or buzzword if you wish, is what is used by those who Lenin calls the orderlies of capitalism. Not only the bourgeoisie, but also those who Lenin addresses as so-called social chauvinists. Social chauvinists are defined as being, I quote, socialists of the word, unquote, that say one thing but do the opposite. They are like embodiments of what psychoanalysis calls fetishistic disavowal. They know very well that they're saying one thing, but they're nevertheless doing something else. Yet their use of phrases obscures the gap between word and deed. It is a practice of language which obfuscates the gap between practice and language. It's a practice of language which obfuscates the gap between practice and language, and thereby embodies a problematic, a fake and false kind of activism. And for Lenin, the pretension of activism is worse than pacifism. For the phraseologist's use of language effectively works as what Lenin calls tranquilizer of the people. It's like the opium for the people, but in strategic use, right, once again. They use words that sound well and everybody likes, like freedom and equality, and they constantly speak of change and transformation, but at the same time effectively hinder anything from happening precisely by only talking about it. The mere phrase is a language tool that creates what Lenin calls treacherous hopes and practical disorientation. These, Lenin, braggarts, are socialists only in words, but chauvinists in reality, unquote. Phrases are the components of a language of false hopes and disorientation, creating, once again, Lenin, a semblance of clarity that veils politics, unquote. It is important to note that a phrase becomes a phrase solely through a peculiar kind of language use. The signifier freedom does, for example, not as such produce disorientation. That is clear, right? It's not inscribed into the word's signifier's substance, but a certain use of it does create practical disorientation. And this practical orientation emerges when language turns into what Lenin calls empty chatter, when people are just blabbering. Hegel once stated that one and the same sentence, enunciated by what he calls a wise and experienced spirit, can express a truth, but when articulated by what he calls a juvenile spirit, is a mere sentence. It's the difference, I would say, between saying I love you and meaning it, and saying I love you and not meaning it, right? I mean, in a sense. This distinction, I think, stands at the background of Lenin's demarcation of a proper political use of language and the language of phrases. It is practice alone that decides, and this practice, and the subjective standpoint taken, and this practice is always historically specific and thus conjuncturally determined. Phrases obscure facts, and in 1917, Lenin even publishes a short text simply called Phrases and Facts. And one are good, the others are, obviously. But worse, they can be used to assimilate key signifiers even of emancipatory politics, because nothing protects them from within. For a phrase becomes a phrase when words are detached from their proper practical affectivity, i.e. when one abstracts from the historical situation in which one employs a certain term or slogan or watchword. This abstraction of historical specificity is also one of the key definitions of what Lenin called revisionism. Phrases are thus indications of language indications of revisionism, symptoms of revisionism. But nothing protects even what may seem to be emancipatory references or words from being turned into mere phrases. Lenin begins, for example, his famous State and Revolution by analyzing all the distortions and displacement that the very founding themes, theses, and even names of Marxism had suffered. He states, I quote, all the social chauvinists, right, socialists only in word and not in action, all the social chauvinists are now Marxists, and in brackets, don't love. Even the name Marx was for Lenin turned into a mere phrase, into an empty reference. How did this happen? Marx became canonized, something like a holy and sacred name. In short, through the reactionary use of language, Marx was turned into Saint Marx, a guy whose works can be studied and adored, but who has no practical value whatsoever for our concrete situation. Such a detachment of Marx from his practical affectivity works by suspending and bracketing the claims constitutively linked to his name and thus relies on specific operations of displacement. I quote Lenin, one pushes to the foreground and extols what is or seems acceptable for the bourgeoisie. Right? You modify Marx such that an average bourgeois citizen likes it. The acceptable elements of Marx stand in the foreground and they cast long concealing shadows on what still seems unacceptable, exaggerated, brazen, or simply too revolutionary. Everyone is sort of against capitalism, and Marx is kind of right, but well, what can we do? The transformation of Marx into Saint Marx, suspending his revolutionary edge, consequentially manifested in the form of harmless idolatry, so that certain groups could align themselves with his name that at the same time have no real relation to the idea of emancipation or revolution. Because for Lenin, this is the claim of State and Revolution, this must imply not that you basically, as everyone says at Lenin's time, affirm that there is class struggle, but you must defend the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a harder thing to do. You admit that. But nonetheless, I mean, that's Lenin's claim, right? If you are not willing to go down that path, you're not a Marxist. Lenin describes this assimilation of Marx, the becoming phrase of the reference to his name, by recourse to a complex set of operations. The phraseologists, inter alia, I quote, omit, obscure, and distort. They repress, deny, cover up, simplify, betray, vulgarize, evade, disregard, misappropriate, and repress. These operations are constitutive for what Lenin calls doctoring of Marxism, into what seems convenient, replacing, I quote again, class struggle with dreams of class harmony, and they produce the effect that people, quote again, even grow out of the habit of thinking about proletarian revolution. It just like sounds too bloody and violent and all that jazz. The phrase use of language thus comes with the subtle practice of assimilating emancipation by appropriating its very signifiers. But to repeat Lenin's famous question, what is to be done? Lenin argues for a desacralization, for what Agamben called a profanation of Marx, and a profanation of language in general. A profanation of language in reference, putting it back to its practical and political use, which can only be realized if one can demonstrate how being a Marxist, I mean, that's Lenin's case, is of practical use and value in this specific, concrete and singularly historical situation. This does not mean to turn to Marx as a trans-historical, dogmatic, canonical, and doctrinal corpus. Rather, it means to understand Marxism not as an orthodox doctrine, but as a point of orientation, a point that allows to get the concrete points on which everything depends and emancipatory practice hinges. The phrasic use of language produces disorientation by introducing a separation between language practice and practice that it obscures, but it can only obscure by distracting, diverting the attention of the agents away from the crucial categories, concepts, and questions of the day that need to be thought. So the phrasic use of language diverts attention. Lenin repeatedly claims that from 1915 on. There is diversion. Right? We're just very entertained by people being Marxists. It sounds nice. And in opposition to this use of language, Lenin envisages a use of language that does not divert, but concentrate and condense. Condense in a point the whole historical situation, a point which then can be taken as a principle of orientation. But if the reactionary, social chauvinist and revisionist use of language refers to and applies a term or a name regardless of the singular and specific conjuncture in which it is used, this has a far-reaching implication. Any term, any name, I said that before, can be appropriated by the wrong side. Nothing protects signifiers from within from becoming reactionary and disorienting signifiers. One might say that there is a danger of reification pertaining to all terms of emancipatory or not vocabulary. Any term can be appropriated by what Kazansky once called the dominant ideology of the word, an ideology of the signifier, sacralizing it, that is, cutting it off from its actual usage. Lenin suggests different means to analyze and counter, reveal and expose the reifying use of language, and I want to briefly indicate a few of his strategies implied in what one might call an ideology critique of reactionary language use. One of Lenin's strategies is to replace reified and disorienting names with new ones. Names are always, as he states in 1917, somehow beside the point, somehow inadequately representing what they name. But at the same time, it is important to analyze when this disparity of a name and the thing becomes disorienting. Renaming is thus linked to a strategic decision that is based on a concrete analysis of the situation. Sometimes it is sufficient to emphasize what the reactionaries practically mean by a certain term. Say they call themselves social democrats, but they're neither social nor democratic. Right. Sometimes it's not enough to only distinguish between different uses of a term. Say what social democrats say, what social democracy is, and what it really is. Sometimes that is not enough, right? I mean, sometimes you have to give up social democracy. In these cases, the demarcation must itself be objectified and symbolically be embodied in a new term, so one needs to invent a new name. This politics and strategy of renaming has limitations of its own, since, for example, after renaming the Russian Social Democratic Party into Bolshevik Party, the same problem re-emerged again, and even though Bolshevism was a quite appropriate term for Lenin, he suggested a further renaming into Communist Party was conjuncturally necessary. Naming the historical state of capitalism imperialism was another such necessity. But renaming may lead into a kind of bad infinite logic that can never fully get rid of the reifying assimilations of the reactionary use of language. Lenin assumes that there is a capitalist tendency, as it were, in language, permanently resurging in language use itself. As Lukács once stated, I quote, "The customary ways of thinking under capitalism had given everyone the tendency always to want to exploit explain the new completely in terms of the old, right? All new things we explain by reference to the old. And this tendency tends to absorb new signifiers and eliminate their indication of novelty. Capitalism even reifies language, as later Guy Debord or Giorgio Agamben will repeatedly insist, but this is already Lenin's insight. So renaming is sometimes needed, but this operation can exhaust its effect. The more renaming, the less the new names are still effectively able to generate a clear and distinct orientation. Right? I mean, the trivial point somehow, right? If you rename your body every day, that confuses people. Obviously. Practically, people get tired of ever new names, and the tendency to constantly produce something new, that's the worst part of it, is also the tendency that is structurally inscribed into capitalist dynamics, right? I mean, just think of Nike can only survive if it produces constantly new shoes, right? The newest shoes, actually. Hence, it completely depends on the conjuncture, on the frequency, and on the rhythm of using this technique of renaming. What is the criterion here? Lukács noted, I quote, "The value of the state as a weapon for the proletariat depends on what the proletariat is capable of making of it," unquote. And similarly, I think, the value of a term as a weapon for the proletariat, for the working class, depends on what the proletariat is capable of thinking and making with it in this or that specific conjuncture. Right? So it's a practical criterion. What can we do with this or that signifier? That's the question. Does it engender new practical possibilities or not? Does it make us more capable? If Lenin's principle is in general, that's to modify the famous statement of Spinoza about the body, that no one has yet determined what a proletariat can do. Part of determining what it actually can do is to link it with the appropriate names, with the appropriate signifiers. Because then one can practically investigate and examine and see what it is able to do. And the evaluation of the appropriateness of the names must be based on a conjunctural analysis. Or to put it differently, and again with a reference to Hegel, Hegel, for example, defines duty as an appropriateness to the tasks of the objective situation. And it thus implies a reflective dimension, understanding what the tasks of the situation are, right? I mean, can only understand what your duty is if you understand the situation and reflect how you should relate to it. And for Lenin, it is the duty of the revolutionary to come up with appropriate symbolizations that entirely depend on the specificity of the situation in which these symbolizations are needed for engendering practical activity of the agent of revolution. A secondary strategy to oppose the capitalist reification of language use is to prohibit certain words from being used too frequently. This holds, for example, for the term dictatorship, as Lenin states from 1918 onwards, as, I quote, "it is too important of a word." Something very weird to read, actually. So dictatorship is too important of a word, so we need to prohibit its use. Its constant use. The prohibition of words is supposed to protect them from overusage and is supposed to hinder them from turning into mere phrases. Since too much use does, in a sense, reduce the intensity and effectiveness, practical effectiveness of a signifier. If you too often and always say, "hey, I love you," this will not come across as an authentic declaration, but rather as a habitualized technique, right? I mean, if each time you meet your partner, say, "hey, I love you," "hey, and you want a drink? I love you," but it wears off. That's what I'm trying to say. Lenin makes this case for the term, this case for the term commune, but mostly the signifier dictatorship. And in the latter case, he thus attempts to prevent it from what he calls being talked in vain, in den Wind gesagt, from turning into, as it were, a dictator shop of the proletariat, if you forgive me this very bad pun. He seeks to prevent people from getting used to terms, because any kind of habit constitutively implies a decrease of the intensity of a word, but also of an activity. And, as Slavoj Žižek has argued, revolutionary always are, I quote, "figures without habit." This also pertains, I think, to their use of language. For habit implies, and this would be Hegel's argument, necessarily a dimension of mechanical reproduction. If you learn a language, you must be able to mechanically reproduce the syntax of a language. Otherwise, you would never be able to speak freely. Right? So, and if it applies the dimension of mechanical reproduction for generating an independency from the particular situation within which an activity is performed, say if you're habitualized to speak, I don't know, French, you're able to speak it in whatever situation. But for Lenin, it's precisely this mechanical and habitual application of a signifier, its mechanical use, that is Shklovsky again, that needs to be avoided because it diverts the attention from the singularity and specificity of the situation. And thus, for him, this is how I read the claim to prohibit certain signifiers from overuse. It's important that we never get used to the most important signifiers. Right? One needs singular signifiers that are used in singular situations to name singular things, but only in singular situations, no overusage. The third and last of Lenin's strategies I want to refer to is his attempt to denounce a phrase as showing it for what it is, to indicate that it contains a reified use of a signifier. To produce this effect, Lenin's techniques are multiple, but I just want to single out one, which is amazing. I've never seen that anywhere else, actually. He sometimes, even in writing, uses intonation, emphasis. He often quotes one of his opponents and inserts just an exclamation mark after a certain claim in brackets, whereby he puts an emphasis on a word, on a signifier, on a claim, focusing the attention on it and singling it out. Eichenbaum calls this the insertion of a periphrase. It's rephrasing, a re-intonation of that thing. It is as if one is in a psychoanalytic setting and the analyst, when the analysant speaks, just interrupts him by saying something like, uh-huh, or just repeating a word used by the analysant. This strategy of re-emphasizing, re-punctualizing someone else's discourse, and one might see why Lacan once claimed that psychoanalysis is essentially a matter of tact. One could say politics for Lenin is also essentially a matter of tact, of putting the right emphasis at the right point, implies to reduce and condense the opponent's discourse to just one signifier. That's what Lenin effectively doing by this punctuation. It implies a technique of simplification. And simplifications, just recall that Hegel once claimed, a thought is the abbreviation of spirit, allows you to see through what might present itself as a complex discourse. Right? I mean, sometimes you just need one sentence where someone says, but freedom for us is freedom of trade, or something like that. And then, right, everything falls apart. So, but let me now, to conclude, leave the analytic and critical dimension of Lenin's strategies and end with a very brief recapitulation of some of his positive and affirmative proposals of emancipatory language use. I think it was the merit of inter alia Deleuze and Guattari to recall or bring back into the discussion a rarely read text of Lenin, namely a text called On Slogans, written in July 1917. It is instructive to note that the Russian word for slogan is, and I can't speak, I googled it, right, but is Losung, it seems to me, which, as the etymological dictionary says, is derived from the German term Losung, which is watchword. The etymology of Losung refers to lots, los, of, say, the lottery, and thus contains a necessary element of contingency. Right? Simply, it is contingent of if this slogan or that slogan works, if this Losung works or another one. The Losung is at the same time the resolve to which one comes after a period of deliberation, etymologically. A certain kind of Entschluss, a resolve after you thought, what shall I do? So it's a kind of conclusion, a kind of symbolic indication of the very transition from thought into practice. It is the formulation of a guiding principle derived from what Lenin calls the analysis of actuality and not possibility, unquote. The slogans are thus supposed to be symbolic inscriptions of practical principles of reflected and thoughtful orientation. Right? I mean, there's supposed to be principle in this specific conjuncture. All power to the Soviets is such a slogan that Lenin in July 1917 basically says, doesn't work anymore, it's wrong. It was just historically falsified. All people who quote that right now are misguided. We need a new slogan. All capitalists are robbers is another of those slogans. Communism is Soviet power plus electrification. Or a less known one, enlightenment, critique, propaganda, and organization. They are sort of directives and force one to always act in such a way, that's Lenin's claim, that one's actions are consistent with the guiding principle. So you should never violate these kinds of rules. This is also why negative slogans for Lenin are less mobilizing than positive ones, because they only negatively tell you what not to do. They work as historically specific, what I would call a historically specified categorical imperative. It's like Kant historized, right? A historically specified categorical imperatives, and are precisely the kind of symbolic representation that for Lenin enabled the formation of a unity of entirely dispersed elements that otherwise, without that symbolic representation, would not unite because they have nothing in common. So it generates a community, a communism, a common reference point of singularities that don't share a common substance, but only a common practice. The right slogan is able to create a common perspective on the world and introduces a principle of orientation that at the same time allows for a kind of subjectivization, that is, for situating oneself in the world solely from the standpoint of that slogan. And I mean, you see the eyes through that slogan. That's your glasses, as it were. In another text written in 1917, my favorite one I have to admit, called Marxism and Insurrection, Lenin defines the way in which such slogan must be created in the following manner, I quote, "The briefer and more trenchant the declaration, the better." The fewer words, the better. Right? Only two other highly important points must be clearly indicated in it. That's the maximum, right? 2 is the maximum. Slogans are pointed formulation, points of worldviews, linguistic condensation, because they reduce and simplify the apparent complexity of the world, such that they reduce and concentrate everything into the perspective of the slogan. Right? Everyone tells you the world is so complex, and the slogan allows you to basically say, is the world in a positive or negative relation, or do people act in a positive or negative relation to the slogan, all power to the Soviets, or not? Right? And you forget about the complexity in a sense. This also means that slogans engender a practical force for Lenin. Either one follows the slogan as a concrete imperative, or one does not. There is no choice somehow but to choose. In this sense, the slogans are points, punctuations of historical situations that force all people, Lenin believes that at least, to situate themselves in relation to them. And if you decide to act accordingly to a certain emancipatory slogan, the world and all practices, everything will look entirely different from what it would look like if you would not affirm the slogan. The world looks different if you once said, "I love you," but right, we're in politics. In short, the subjective, subjectivized, and subjectivizing language of emancipation is a language of slogan. That's what I'm trying to suggest. Of watchwords, of points in the form of words, signifying points, pointed and pointing signifiers that follow what Lenin states in Marxism and Insurrection. I quote him, "One can today only remain faithful to Marxism if one treats insurrection as an art." One might modify this claim and state that today one can only remain faithful to Lenin, or emancipation, or maybe both, if one again, at least in politics, with Lenin starts to speak not in tongues, but in slogans. But it's important to have the correct ones, obviously, right? For by means of the slogan, one does not simply reflect the world, but subjectivize and create it as the space into which one intervenes. The language of slogans is thus not adherent to an advanced form of practice. It's not simply performative, I think. But to use a term introduced by Werner Hamacher, it is afformative. Or to use Badiou's term, it's generic. It creates the very form of collective political practice while acting, and implies, in this sense, an art of politics, right? An aesthetics of politics. It forms the very form of politics while acting politics. Very close to Kleist's meandering formulation of one's thoughts while speaking. Right? This is what I'm trying to say. And it's enabled by the slogans. So it produces condensations of the world that are supposed to make it into our own creation. And right now I shut up.
Okay, so I begin now. Okay. Okay, so This is a year of remembrance and celebrations on the left. There are good reasons for that. 2017 marks the 150th anniversary of the publication of Karl Marx's Das Kapital. It was published in 1867, which is a hugely important historical fact for the communist idea. Also, this year is the centenary of the first great socialist revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. There are a great number of academic, political conferences, books, journals, and other intellectual and political initiatives devoted to these two events. However, we seem to be less attentive to another, perhaps equally important historical fact in the long history of emancipatory struggles. January 2017 marked the 50th anniversary of the formation of the otherwise very short-lived Shanghai People's Commune. It was perhaps the most tragic case in the entire socialist experiments of the previous century. It was the most serious attempt to advance from socialism to the communist form of organization of society, with the local workers attacking the party and the army, thus establishing what they called their own self-government of the producers, which interestingly is very different from Yugoslavia's self-management form. The tragedy of the Shanghai Commune does not consist in the failure of the form of organization of society, but on something even more tragic: the socialist reaction to communism. And there are similar examples where socialism became an enemy of communist emancipation. Speaking of festivities, there is another important historical fact that is not being raised at all. Is not being raised by the left at all, at least to my knowledge, and which in the final instance of analysis can be qualified as one of the two conditions of modernity itself, and thus of the emancipatory struggle that arose from modernism onwards, as well as of modern philosophy as a whole. In October 1517, Martin Luther hung his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Castle Church. One could argue that the consequences of accepting or rejecting the Protestant event determines one position in the philosophical orientation within Marxism as such. It is of philosophical and political importance to draw the consequences of what is at stake if a philosopher accepts not only the consequences of Christ's event, man was made man, but also of the Lutheran event, as Hegel put it, quote, to recognize reason as the rose in the cross of the present. Today, the philosopher who fully embraces the consequences of these events, or to quote Hegel, the thinker that tries to carry out the task of accepting the whole truth and harshness of the world's God-forsakenness, in contemporary Marxism is Slavoj Žižek. The name of Marxist philosopher who rejects this and instead embraces Catholic universalism is Louis Althusser. In the last instance of analysis, this is the ground on which the difference between Althusser and Žižek is constituted. However, there is another important date of historical events. In 1817, Hegel published his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, the first volume, I think. Okay, but enough with festivities. Here a pressing question persists. Why do we celebrate the past events? Is it merely a ceremonial dimension of it, or there is a legacy which is worth sticking to and recuperating? Let me say the following. Memory is not a political category. We don't need to remember in order to avoid the tragic experience of the previous century socialist experiments to happen again. The whole academic discipline of memory studies, I don't know how it is here, but in the Balkans they are very, very famous and influential, is one big ideological enterprise. What prevents, or rather has the potential of preventing the same experience by the way of reinventing the idea of communism is thinking. Thinking, pure thinking. And as Hegel would have it, thinking without further determinations is the main and perhaps the only enemy of repetition of these horrible events in history. In What is to be Done, discussing the new trends within socialism, Lenin argues that the new critical trends in this tradition, arguing against these new trends, are equated with opportunism. This opportunism is identified with social democracy, whose call for freedom of criticism practically for Lenin means the freedom to convert social democracy into a party of bourgeois ideas. Then he goes on to argue that while freedom is a great word, under its banner the most bloodiest war were waged, the working people were exploited, and so on. As he writes, quote, "The cry heard today, long live freedom of criticism, is too strongly reminiscent of the fable of the empty barrel." But what is the meaning of socialism today? The concept, or rather the idea of socialism, is reminiscent of the fable of the empty barrel. Socialism is the name of the outdated political utopia whose experiments in all their form, be they Soviet, Chinese, Cuban, Albanian, Yugoslav, and so on, failed thoroughly and completely in their implementation. In the contemporary situation, the usage of the term socialism is obscure, detached, and alienated from its initial idea. But what does revoking socialism as a term and a political concept mean in the contemporary present? Does it stand for the abolition of property as such, as Marx and Engels envisaged in the Communist Manifesto, or does it represent solely a transformation of ownership? So we have the shift from private property, capitalism, to the state property, that is socialism. It appears that it's easier to envisage what socialism is not, rather than what today stands in the name of it. Socialism is not a negation of property as such, but it is a negation of one particular type of property, thus leaving untouched the field of social relations in which property, be it private or state-owned, operates and remains the touchstone of the existing social relations. Following Marx, Slavoj Žižek is right to refer to socialism as vulgar communism. In this sense, the future of socialism is always capitalism because of the structural dimension of property itself. It is the flaws of the idea itself, which are constitutive of the idea of socialism, that necessitates its transformation into capitalism. Therefore, we should abandon, I think, the illusion that socialism is the first phase towards full communism. Žižek argues that future will be communist or socialist. In our thinking the way out of capitalism, we have to bear in mind that one cannot just stick to communist idea, a thesis which Žižek has been repeating for a while now. What gives communism the political and ideological as well as historical relevance are the series of antagonisms which makes it a practical political urgency. Thus, global capitalism contains such antagonisms that in a long run will render its perpetual reproduction impossible. Based on this, Žižek enumerates 4 such antagonisms, which he names as 4 riders of apocalypse. Quote, "The looming threat of an ecological catastrophe, the inappropriateness of the notion of private property in relation to the so-called intellectual property, the socio-ethical implications of new techno-scientific developments, especially in biogenetics, and last but not least, the creation of new forms of apartheid, new walls and slums." The end of quote. If the reference to the commons justifies the return to the concept of communism, then the first 3 antagonisms should be read from the perspective of the 4th one. Otherwise, as Žižek notes, quote, "the first 3 effectively concerns questions of humanity's economic, anthropological, even physical survival, while the 4th one is ultimately a question of justice." And it's very interesting that he's not using the word equality here, but justice. The risk is then to avoid the liberal appropriation of the concept of the commons, to resuscitate it from the vague notions such as solidarity or the common good or other similar political and conceptual sophisms. The enclosure of the commons results in a process of proletarization, which certainly goes beyond the social class imagined by Marx. Here is where communism gains its philosophical, conceptual, and political relevance. Unlike socialism, which, quoting Žižek, wants to resolve the first 3 antagonisms without addressing the 4th, without the singular universality of the proletariat. The only way for the global capitalist system to survive is a long-term antagonism and simultaneously avoid the communist solution will be to reinvent some kind of socialism in the guise of communitarianism or populism or capitalism with Asian values or some other configuration. To push Zizek, the end of quote. To push Zizek's thesis a bit further, we might say that in order for capitalism to survive as a dominant form of organization of production, it must become socialist. How? One of the answers is automatization of jobs. No wonder that even the representatives of Silicon Valley recognize this problem, according to Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla. Because of computerization, intelligent machinery, robotization, and so on, the human labor force will be replaced with machinery and robotics. As a consequence, quote from Musk, there is a pretty good chance we end up with a universal basic income or something like that due to automation, end of quote. Although this may ultimately be seen as the end of capitalism as such, we must nonetheless be attentive apropos universal basic income. Some sociologist, I forgot the name, he's Belgian, I can't remember his name, I think it's Philippe van Parijs, but I can't remember, have argued that the basic income is the only way through which capitalism can be reformed and ultimately saved. I think at the end of the day, the case of Lula in Brazil actually proves this. The ultimate difficulty at the level of the task of philosophy, insofar it is grounded on the communist hypothesis, is to outline the fundamental concepts through which one can think and critique the contemporary present. That is to say, how to move beyond capitalism without falling into the socialist trap. I maintain that socialism is not the first phase of communism. Thus, I would propose a thesis which will shed light to this heretic proposition. In the history of previous century, there was a clear tension or even antagonism between communism and socialism. While the former was the name of ferocious emancipatory potential of an idea of organization, the Bolshevik Revolution from, let's say, 17 to 20, or the Cultural Revolution, and so on. Socialism, on the other hand, was the name of stabilizing effect of this force. Socialism was introduced in order for a society to be stabilized or be put back on a track, a situation of an explosion of emancipatory potential. That is, it was introduced for domesticating purposes. I mean, you can even see this in Yugoslavia after the so-called demonstration of the '68, or in Albania in those years of liberalization following the Khrushchev speech and so on. Therefore, the perhaps not so paradoxical thesis is: after the failure of communism, after the failure of socialism, we need to think communism. One of the most polemic aspects of Slavoj Žižek's return to Lenin is his simultaneous attempt to revitalize the Hegelian theory of the state. At the crossing point of these two lines of argumentation is the need to recuperate the analytic dimension of the Leninist party form, and the need to rethink the critique of the state in order to conceive it in what he calls a non-statal state. For Žižek, the party is the site of politics. For politics to exist, it has not only to exist in an organized form, but in order for an activity to be qualified as politics, it has to be organized in the party form. An immediate and equally important question beckons. Why do we need to go back to the party form politics after the catastrophic failure of the socialism in the previous century experiment? The contemporary forms of egalitarian horizontal forms of organization simply do not do what they aim to do. The Communist Party form, in opposition to the bourgeois party, is perhaps the only political form of organization which proposed itself to be organized around an indifference rather than around a differentiation. This manifests itself to be itself both in its unreal claim to aim at the abolishment of capitalism, which makes it detached from the world in the present situation, and in the sense that it produces an identification of comrades that is not grounded on any concrete or particular aspect of the militants as well as militancy. Therefore, the Communist Party form is the appropriate form of politics to deal with the problems that are not reducible to local or to directly concrete oppressions such as capitalist exploitation, imperialism, colonialism, etc. This point becomes clearer, I believe, if we bring about the distinction between organizing around the indifference and difference or identity, which in fact was the ambition of the party Foreign Politics. This will shed light to a thesis proposed by Frederick Jameson in his recent book, An American Utopia, who brings up about the military thesis as a part of his utopian project of universal army and universal conscription. The army is one of the few instances where this productive and inclusive indifference is still maintained in some vague level in today's world. The military cuts across particular identifications by focusing on logistics and organization of life. In fact, what interested Lenin and the Bolsheviks about the military form of life, that is the militarization of life, was both their attempt to survive in very difficult and rough situations in Russia after the revolution, as well as at the same time experimenting with some level of productive differentiations. This brings us to a famous dictum of Lenin, the concrete analysis of the concrete situation. The real difficulty in Lenin's dictum is not analyzing the concrete situation, what is truly going on singularly, but rather providing a concrete analysis. That is to say, an analysis that is not more committed to the identification of the analyst as an abstract analyst of a concrete situation, or as someone who can guarantee that providing the correct analysis will guarantee his or her recognition as a true Marxist. Undertaking a concrete analysis is traumatic precisely because it gives priority to the concrete situation over the reproduction of the analyst as an abstract individual, which means that it takes the side of the people over the side of the left, and waiting for the effects of his or her intervention or analysis in order to find out where one stands. It is precisely this point where risk is located. But what does it mean to invent communism, or reinvent communism, as Badiou claims, in an era which, as we all know, has declared Marxism as a possible political ideological project dead? And I think here is the point where we resonate with each other. Here comes a paradox. Albeit being declared dead again and again, Marx is present everywhere precisely because he has been neutralized. Everyone speaks of Marx, but in a distorted way. Whenever socialists refer to him, he is neutralized, rendered in a poet of revolutionary past or into an archaic messiah. Marx is thus transformed into a harmless icon. Communists elevate Marx to a sacred position, which is another way of not engaging with what is at the core of Marx's work, that is his Capital, or the project of critique of political economy in general. It is at this point that one should locate the position of the contemporary left. Or to go a step further, we can say that at every conjuncture we have a distorted Marx. This was the case with Lenin's time, as Frank elaborated, and this is certainly the case in our time. But the difference lies in the form of the distortion between our present time and Lenin. That is to say, today it is through overexposure that we ultimately leave Marx alone. Everybody is a Marxist at the level of analysis, and non-Marxist, that is to say, not communist, at the level of practice. This distinction takes this kind of form. Yes, we know capitalism is bad, but Marxism does not provide solution or vision for politics. Therefore, the struggle against capitalism has to be fought culturally, and so on, practically the regression into the level of identity politics. As a consequence, leftist politics and theory exist only as a reaction to the actions of the ruling class, precisely because Marxism is taken as a purely critical tool. And as such, only reactive politics becomes possible. All this points to a universal party form of political organization, which should include the military aspect proposed by Fred Jameson. We should bear in mind that it was also Lenin who in his text Dual Power also proposed a somewhat militarized state or form of organization of the society. The standard critique of 20th century socialism is that it was the unification of the party and the state. In the USSR, everything belonged to the state with one exception, and that was the Communist Party, which functioned from a clear distance from the state. The status of the party was practically the one of the public organization. With regard to this thesis, Zizek's position is that the failure of the 20th century communism, among other reasons, was due to its deliberate distanciation and not proximity to power. When he writes about the relation between the state and politics, he says that, quote, the failure of communist state party politics is above all and primarily the failure of anti-statist politics, of the endeavor to break out the constraint of the state to replace statal forms of organization with direct non-representative form of self-organization councils. The end of quote. Today, when the market economy, as well as the state as we know it, are not the answers to the growing radicalization of the contradictions of global capitalism, we need to propose the third solution. The party state, which is best characterized as neither the subtraction from the state, nor taking over the government together with accepting the agenda which was set by the ruling class, the enemies, and all the rest of them. Zizek offers a response to the predominant leftist position of the distance toward the state. Another quote. If you do not have an idea of what do you want to replace the state with, you have no right to withdraw from the state. Instead of withdrawing into a distance from the state, the true task should be to make the state itself work in a non-statal mode. The end of quote. This is a crucial task today, or maybe even the sine qua non of every contemporary communist politics. The left should unconditionally rehabilitate and reappropriate the necessity of having a strong body that is capable of radically transforming and reorganizing the whole of social life. I think recently in one of his latest books, not sure how latest it is, he proposed the idea of bureaucratic communism. Zizek, I mean. Far from being afraid of this as a new totalitarian project, a strong political body is necessary, a condition for any politics whose aim is breaking away with global capitalism and imagining new forms of social organization that is not based in private interest and profit. This form of social organization is ultimately much closer to the left than it is to the right-wing politics, which claims to own the idea itself. A new form of organization emerges, which takes the form, or should emerge, which following Zizek, will take the form of people, movement, party, leader. This Zizek's tetrad is the civic form of Jameson's universal military form of social organization, I would claim. So given this, what is to be done? One of the issues of contemporary left is that of representation versus participation. In Living in the End Times, I think, Zizek argued that the original sin of the left is to be found exactly where one doesn't expect it, in the young Hegelians who reject the authority and alienating effect of the state. On the other hand, the Italian philosopher Domenico Losurdo suggested that the state should reappropriate the Hegelian idea of the ethical state, a state which is founded on the shared ethical order. Hegel writes that, quote, the ethical order has been represented by the mankind as eternal justice, as gods absolutely existent, in contrast with which the empty business of individuals is only a game of seesaw, the end of quote. Or better still, the ethical order or ethical substance is, quote from Hegel, an absolute authority and power infinitely more firmly established than being of nature, the end of quote. In other words, this is another name for the party. The party, in its Žižekian conceptualization, also I don't think he would seriously agree with this, but nonetheless, is not an electoral one, but a strong body which doesn't only represent the people, but includes everyone in it. The inclusion is not so much an easy solution as a crucial problem in every attempt to recuperate Hegel's theory of the state, which is indeed a very, very difficult task. The first thing to show is that Hegel is very clear in his remarks on that his remarks on the state is not some sort of a answer to socio-economic problems internal to a given nation. This is the liberal answer, I think, to the problem of the state. In his understanding, the state is the answer for the internationalist as well as the problem of the commons, which do not fit neatly into borders and other so-called cultural or whatever parameters. Hegel was aware of this, and it is for this reason that the state is, as he puts it, the march of God in the world. That is to say, it is a state which is ultimately not representative of a nation or a community. For Hegel, the state was tied to the problem of dealing with multiple nations, as was the case with the Prussian Empire, the pre-German state. The Hegelian state, if it were to be rethought today in the period of the absolute domination of global capitalism, would have to take a different form. It has to be rethought in more radically global terms and framework, much more radical than global capitalism is in itself. The difference can be thought in terms of multinationalism, capital, versus the internationalism. During the time of the Second Internationale, Marxists had an intuition to this issue, precisely with the debate between the Leninists and Trotskyists on the forms of political association. Namely, the debate was centered on whether the international should take the form of a party or an association of the parties. I think Lenin preferred the latter, which in fact brings him much closer to Hegel than many Marxists, given the federative character of his proposal. For him, the international should be an international state, that is, an association of emancipatory forces from each local fight against the global capitalism. Based on this, it is of crucial importance to show that when Zizek talks about the state and Hegel, he does so under Marxist conditions. That is to say, he talks about it from the perspective of internationalism and association. I can't pronounce this word. Okay, it can go without.
Associationism?
Yeah, but no, forget it. The party is the only political organization which can make the state work in a non-statal way. In short, it is irreducible to nation, to the state, and to the firm. Three institutions that the Japanese philosopher Kojin, I think Kojin Karatani is the way it's pronounced, associated with a trinity which organizes global capitalism. So his trinity is nation, state, and capital. You cannot fight one without fighting the three of them. He actually links the failure of socialism to this trinity. At the present time, there is no tendency onto which we can rely. The currents are against us in all their forms and shapes. The party is the only form of political organization which can go against, to put it in Lacanian terms, the big other. That is, against the present historical tendency. There is a tendency among some leftists to return to the nation state. More recently the case with Greece after the so-called capitulation of Syriza government. The current crisis of capitalism with all its excesses, think only of the refugee crisis, if nothing, render visible one fact. The nation state is not an answer to the antagonisms produced by the dynamics of global capitalism. The enclosure of the commons, the shared ethical substance, compels us towards a radical interpretation of the Marxist notion of the proletarian. I think Zizek has been working on this quite a bit. He identifies four such enclosures: one, intellectual property; ecological catastrophes; biogenetic revolution; explosions of social divisions, or the excluded slums, favelas, and so on. The proletarian position today with regard to what Zizek refers to as four-horse riders to the apocalypse is a position which relates to the deprived substance of our subjectivity. That is to say, the proletarian position is that position in which the worker is being taken away the product of his own work, labor, reducing him to a subjectivity without substance, where he refers to Marx's Grundrisse, I believe. Employing the notion of the proletariat and proletarization, proletarian position, and so on, is crucial for remaining within the field of politics today. All these problems cannot be solved within the confines of the nation state. Herein comes the necessity for rethinking the party form politics and working for a party-state form. In the struggle against global capitalism, this is the only way to move beyond the bourgeois state form. For instance, Karatani proposed some sort of updated League of Nations, which would take the current situation into account. League of Nations before the United Nations after the Second World War. When was that? Through taking over the state and the state power and transforming it into such a way that the party doesn't remain only a party, but it effectively becomes a state. Such is our task today. The party form is appropriate to the challenges that lie ahead of us precisely because it is essentially tied to the problem of indifference. The universality through identification, unlike the identitarian paradigm of the classical classical universalism, is the only one that can withstand internationalization. This should be our starting point. However, unlike previous incarnations of it, which kept the logic of indifference and the logic of the state separate, with the former putting the latter in check, making sure people could speak as anyone indifferently within the party, our contemporary task is to create a version of the party form that, by taking over the state's claim to power over our lives, we can also guarantee people's right to live as anyone, anywhere, etc. Here we can think, I think, of the refugee crisis which hit Europe a couple of years ago and which is still going on. Only when we can be anyone can we also be anywhere. It is for this reason that the strong organization that doesn't put the emphasis on the particularities as special or unique, but rather thinks them from the standpoint of cold logistics and other technicalities, only such an organization can produce, if done properly, an internationalist subjectivity that is politically useful today. One of the main challenges of the present century communism is to think of a radically new form of social organization which is neither reminiscent of the previous century state-controlled economy or the contemporary regulated, controlled, free market economy. While this is a serious challenge of our era, we know too well that it cannot be done neither in the forms of local and organized communities nor within the confines of the nation state. In this regard, it is worth thinking the universal party form as an alternative to the state and market-based organization of society. Therefore, my hypothesis is one way of thinking of a new form of social organization both beyond the nation state and the market is through the rethinking or conceptualizing universal party and its structures. The universal party form, no matter how utopian it may sound, and I know it is the only way to fight global capitalism. And it seems increasingly clear that in desperate situations, such as those we are currently facing, utopias are the only viable solution. Indeed, perhaps only utopias are the name for a new field of experimentation of what Marx once called possible communism. I want to conclude by a reference to Freud, psychoanalysis and Marxism, or the party form. It is pretty clear that there is a fundamental difference between psychoanalysis and Marxism. The relation between them is constituted by an immanent tension. On one level, psychoanalysis begins where Marxism declares its impasses and its limits. For Marxism, as well as for psychoanalysis, the sufferings of the people, or individuals respectively, is a starting point. Psychoanalysis aims at reducing the pain and sufferings of its subjects in an analytical session by means of providing interpretative interventions through speech in the most basic level. On the other hand, Marxism is concerned with the suffering of the proletariat and the oppressed classes in general. A patient in psychoanalytical session cannot revolt, at least not to an extent, that a proletarian does at a factory or at his or her working place. Also, one can assume that it is impossible to psychoanalyze capitalism or society as such, as Freud maintained in his later life. I think it was in the Civilization and its Discontent. But is this so? What if we take a step further and argue that, strictly speaking, there is no individual in psychoanalysis? The individual is always already a part of social products and relations, and as such, an individual is conceivable only insofar as he or she is placed in relations with others, precisely within the ideological, economic, political instances, and so on. It is enough to recall the title of Freud's book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. Here, he was not talking about isolated individuals. One of the dreams of the left liberals and socialists in a society in which individual pathologies, sufferings, and miseries will be eradicated once the glorious communist form of social organization will come. For many, socialism equals an ideal society in which exploitation and oppression, as well as psychosis, neurosis, hysteria, and other sufferings, other obstacles to an individual's well-being and happiness belong to the past. I mean, they imagine a society of collective happiness and shininess. In his studies of hysteria, Freud states, quote, "You will be able to conceive yourself that much will be gained if we succeed in transforming your hysterical misery into common unhappiness. With a mental life that has been restored to health, you will be better armed against the unhappiness." The end of quote. If you are to modify this and replace 3 words from Freud's passage about the purpose of analysis, the purpose of communism, we get the following result. You will be able to conceive yourself that much will be gained if we succeed in transforming expropriation of labor into common unhappiness. With a social life that has been restored to justice, you will be better armed against that unhappiness. That is, the whole point of communism should be to include discontent as an integral element of society. Discontent as such will never disappear, and I think this is one of the main Jameson's theses in the American Utopia. But we can utilize it for more creative and progressive purposes. In other words, I want to propose the following thesis: communism transforms collective exploitation into common unhappiness. This is exactly the critique and difference between Lacan also and other psychoanalytic orientations. Based on this, we can argue that in Zizek's theory of the state, we need to find a proper place to deliberate social discontents. Individuals have to constitute themselves individuals and find their place in the world. We are always within the world, and as such, we are confronting with the questions and problems of belonging, inclusion, identity, etc. But Hegel writes, as Hegel writes in Phenomenology of Spirit, quote, "The share in the total work of mind that falls to the activity of any particular individual can only be very small." The end of quote. Our suffering thus come as an effect of our alienation within and by the social order. The question beckons, what sort of institutions are necessary to give proper form to this social suffering? Recently, again, Zizek proposed bureaucratic communism. This is something that I think we have to think about. Zizekian theory of the state gives a form to discontent that makes it unnecessary to identify with an emblem of it. That is to say, it makes discontent useful as such. Thus, the party can serve also as a tool for rendering suffering productive for the benefit of the collective social life. Yeah. Okay.
So I think what we
Sorry.
I know
Oh,
you,
yeah.
you
My
want
God.
to say.
Please.
I just want to say right now you can ask all the mean things that you have in your minds right now, and I don't know. I mean,
Smash us practically.
insults. I mean, even praises are okay, I guess. But I mean, I assume that are not.
Well, I will start with the praise. Thank you so much. It was very, very, very interesting. And I expected there would be quite a few questions and comments. But first, maybe not all of you know that yesterday we had also a very, very interesting study group session with the two of you in collaboration with radical philosophy at the University of Bergen, where we were discussing a bit about, amongst other things, about the role of the philosopher. So I would like to throw the ball a little bit in the direction of the role of the artist today, maybe, because we are here in an art space. But that's a more kind of general suggestion for a direction. If anybody is sitting there burning with a question, please.
I mean, no, you know what happens in the late Platonic dialogues, right? I mean, that's what everyone fantasizes about. That someone keeps on talking all the time, and then someone else says, "Well, Eureka! This is how it must be." If you wish, you can. But what?
Yeah. Thanks for two lovely talks. I would try to formulate one question for each of you. While listening to you, Frank, I noticed that you sort of followed Alain Badiou in these four conditions, starting with love and then moving to science and politics and the arts. But what struck me when you were emphasizing the role of language and this sort of new beginning with with changing the discourse was what Alenka Supancis refers to as the fifth condition, which is, religion. And within Alain Badiou's writing, the place where he really addresses that question is precisely regarding Christianity as the foundation of universality, when he speaks about the apostolic discourse. And he does so, I believe, with at least implicit reference to the Lacanian notion of discourse, so that of implementing something new by sort of modifying the references that are used in the social tie and the way we articulate ourselves as a society. And it struck me as well when you were referring to Lenin's notion of slogans and how they had to be condensed. What you did not refer to in that connection was the master signifier, or the point de capital. And it strikes me that, actually what you are rephrasing is a sort of basic Lacanian idea that what you need is sort of introducing a shift in the social texture by shifting discourse, and the way you do it is sort of pinpointing a master signifier that redirects the entire texture. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And what I would like Agon Hamza to comment on is the idea of the universal party. Yeah. Is that an idea that actually occurs in Zizek?
No,
it does
not. No, it does not.
No, because it strikes me that if what we need now is a universal party, you have sort of two different versions of that universal party. You could think about, any party within a Western capitalist liberal democracy would be universal in a certain sense. Anybody could, affiliate himself or herself to that party. And it's sort of an empty universality. we can accept anybody or everybody. And the other kind would be, well, the Revolutionary Party, where the universality of this party would be that it sort of represents what is not included in the totality. That would be kind of the symptom that stands in for the singularity, that stands in for the universal. But I suppose that what you are referring to is neither one of these two. If what we need now on a sort of extra-national state level would be a different kind of universal party. And, well, you followed Zizek quite a bit in your talk, but if that notion is not from Zizek...
No, it is not.
No, I would like
sorry.
I would like to, well, to elaborate a little bit on that.
Sorry.
And, well, the idea of the party is what Zizek claims has been, well, superseded. That is, well, kind of obsolete today. We cannot return to the Leninist idea of the party. So, well, that would be my question to both of you.
Want to go?
As you wish.
No, I need to go to the restroom.
Okay, goodbye. So yeah, no, I mean, you're right. And what was lacking, sort of. So I had an implicit discourse in what I said, and the implicit discourse was kind of an attempt to understand what it means that certain signifiers, certain words, they can be slogans, but they can be individualized signifiers, can function as generating an orientation as master signifiers that from which onwards entire symbolic field is structured. But why I didn't frame it in that way is, and in the end I'm going to say something about, I think, Alenka's claim about the additional condition, because it's, I mean, that's a very, let's say, I don't know how many people of you have spent a lot of time studying Badiou and debating how Badiou relates to Lacan, whatsoever. But I want to say something about that. But and that's the part of the paper which was unfortunately missing, right? The part of the paper which was unfortunately missing is what the hell to do with what I said that Lenin is doing today. I mean, what to do with this today, when precisely the precondition of what Lenin's practice relies upon is sort of lacking, right? Because it's hard to take the Lenin standpoint today to basically say, well, the revolution is inevitable and necessary, right? I mean, this is what I refer to as the precondition from which Lenin's whole discourse and thought and interventions take their form, from the assumption that it's absolutely certain that there will be the revolution because it's already in actu. That's what Lukács already saw. So, and what this unwritten, thought through, lacking part would have said is the following one. That I think Lenin is very productive in depicting certain means for analyzing the effectivity of political signifiers. Let's put it like that. Think of American politics. Sanders, right, was a democratic socialist. And at first I was seriously surprised that someone in the US could proclaim himself to be a socialist. I mean, that's a surprise. But I think that wouldn't have worked with proclaiming himself a democratic communist. Because there seems to be still a difference, right, between communism and socialism. So, and there are certain words or signifiers that are, I think, unjustifiably, and one can see that in the work of Zizek, Badiou, but also of others, left to sort of the wrong camp. I mean, Badiou made a huge plea for the productive and emancipatory use of discipline. There's nothing wrong with discipline as such. I mean, one does not like to be disciplined from the outside. Of course, I can see that, but I mean, right? His nice slogan is "Those who have nothing have only their discipline," and this seems to be. I mean, to me, this seems to be quite convincing, actually. So the missing parts would have said maybe Lenin's conjunctural analysis could provide us with a kind of toolbox to see how to, in the present conjuncture, come up with a vocabulary, with terminology of re-articulating under the assumption that there is no revolution just right now happening, what kind of concepts need to be reactivated, rethought. I mean, maybe it's internationalism, but I mean, internationalism is easy to get. Marxism is easy to get. I don't know if you know anything of German politics, but Heiner Geisler, a guy from the Christian Democrats, recently died. Former super conservative, turned a little bit to the left. He, in the end of his life, was a dedicated Marxist, right? Because he thought, well, the world is unjust and so forth. Marx saw that. And everyone thought, okay, he's a weirdo. But nonetheless, I mean, no one was shaken up by he himself describing himself as a Marxist. So Marx seems to be a weird kind of, right? I mean, there seems to be a problem. So, and sometimes I would go as far as long as there is no new master signifier, a new point which restructures the whole field, maybe sometimes precisely the concept that generate the most embarrassment to all sides are the ones that need to be re-evaluated, right? I mean, there's this joke, I used that yesterday already, but for those of you who weren't there, that I think Zizek came up with, like a guy in Stalinist Russia is sent to the Gulag, and he knows his letters will be read or censored. So he basically tells his friends, listen, all the letters I'm gonna write everything that I actually mean as written in blue ink, and everything else I will write in red ink, so you know that there is a difference. And then they receive, I mean, he's sent to the Gulag, they receive the first letter, and the letter basically says, whoa, the Gulag is wonderful. I mean, nature, impressive work, it's so much fun, colleagues, and even the prison guards, lovely, lovely, the only thing missing is red ink. Right? So, and Zizek makes from this the argument that sometimes the language expressing or articulating, symbolically representing the position one wants to take can be missing. My suggestion is, why not take up precisely those things, those terms, as long as there is not a complete restructuring of the field, that seem to be most embarrassing. Discipline would be one. I think, but you and Zizek and others made the case for communism because this signifier, it's hard to defend. I mean, I think Zizek made even the case with dialectical materialism. But I mean, dialectical materialism is a nonsensical theory. I mean, let's be honest. Read what Stalin says about dialectical materialism and try to defend that. That's really a hard job. However, I mean, it's so somehow. But I'm not making fun of that. But I'm saying it indicates, let's say, a possibility for developing something precisely from these kind of pointed signifiers that are weirdly excluded. I mean, in my case, I would even defend fatalism, and then maybe that's enough. So this is Lenin put to use in a contemporary setting. This was the part missing, and that is what I try to say. So I don't think today one could be a proponent of freedom, for example. I think that will immediately backfire miserably. I mean, George Bush fought wars for freedom, right? And that seems sort of problematic.
Yeah. Okay. So the party form, the universal party form particularly, is not really Zizek's thing. No. I was just trying to work through his stuff, and I think. And so no, it's not Zizek's concept. I think. We can discuss to which extent he would really agree with this, but that's not my concern. What I think is that his three forms of political intervention, so to speak, he has sometimes it's more radical not to do nothing than be part of it, like let's say not give money to the banks, that would be pretty radical. Then sometimes act, and then the third form I can't remember which one is it now. I think act moderately or participate in elections or something like this. It doesn't matter. Recently, I think especially with the refugee crisis, the book which got him so much hate, Against the Double Blackmail. I mean, it's there you see the ultimate impotence of the left, not on his writing, but on the contrary, on the reactions that he got. So this is what I was trying to say, like the organization towards indifference, you know, which and I think this is what he meant with that. When he evoked Jameson that we should use the army for transportations and such. This indifference, I think, is part of logical and nothing more than logical form of logical aspect of dealing with so-called cultural problems. Why the party form? I think the following, because there is a problem in the Marxist tradition that or that's my, as Frank would say, arrogant claim, that there is no Marxist theorist, be it a leader of a movement, Lenin, Gramsci, whatever, or a Marxist philosopher like Lukács or Althusser, really failed in providing a good theory of the state. The Frenchies, to use Frank's word again from yesterday, provide a good theory of power, but not a good analysis of the state. Why I think that the universal party form should replace the state is based again on Zizek, when he argues that with the refugee crisis, especially with the refugee crisis, but also others, we cannot simply organize ourselves in a nation-state level. We have to move beyond. What is that? European Union is certainly not a solution. So we need to move beyond the state and beyond the market. I think in experimenting with this non-statal form of operation and his tetrad of people, movement, party, and the leader, I think the universal party form can be perhaps provisionally an answer to, or a material with which we can work through this.
Thank you. I would like to try again to throw this a little bit in the direction of art. So, not that long ago, in June, we had Jacques Rancière here, and you're familiar with his categorization of the ethical regime of art, the representative regime of art, and the aesthetic regime of art, which we are currently, as contemporary artists, apparently doing. So when you're talking, Frank, about languages and new terminology, new signifiers, maybe, because I feel like maybe we as contemporary artists, when we try to work in relation to politics, we feel a little bit at a loss. Do we also need some kind of new terminology around what we're doing, or maybe a new language of art, another way of... You also talk about slogans and these kind of things. Maybe how could practice as contemporary artists relate to that? And also to you, Agon, when you talk about this universal party form, because art and culture in general has a role to play also in terms of, you know, how we think politics and how we think about. Is there a way that artists could have a role to play in this idea?
Okay. I'm really not sure. Of course, art has a role to play in it, but can I be cynical? I didn't draw the departments of the department or the secretariats, or how do you call it? I mean, of course, art is a very important. I think we discussed it earlier, that it gives form to an event or a development. And can there be an artistic party form? I don't know, but I certainly think that art, the way Badiou understands it, and to which I subscribe completely, is a practice which cannot be simply left outside or under estimated or such?
I mean, let me try to say three things. The first thing is, I mean, what always puzzled me about Rancière is that he basically argues that there are different regimes of art, and then one has a problem that is quite similar to Hegel's aesthetics. Are they simply historical, or are they structural? Because he basically says, right, the ethical regime and the representational regime, there is representational art even today, and ethical art, but while they emerge historically, it sounds as if they were at least formulated at a historical point, but nonetheless they have a trans-historical value whatsoever. But what I've found the most puzzling, or maybe I'm simply not getting it, that might be, I mean, maybe I'm just too stupid, that might very well be the case, is why he so strictly seems to be saying that the aesthetic regime of art does as such not imply a principle of organization or of discrimination, right? I mean, he very strongly, on the one hand side, makes the theoretical claim, and he does the same when he talks about politics, that it's just like the moment of the redistribution of the sensible, right? When a sensible organization, or an aesthetic, what he calls primary aesthetic organization, collapses, is precisely, can only be understood as an appearance of whatever being, quelconque, right? I mean, a gathering, a collection that follows no principle of organization whatsoever, right? I mean, this is why he likes in Vertov, when workers are shown, book pages are shown, machines are shown, and so forth. And this very collection of images of things of fundamentally different kind don't follow any hierarchy, they have no common substance whatsoever. But he always seems, at least if I'm not entirely misreading him, he very much seems to insist, and that is also what he says within the political realm, that no moment of organization is implied, right? I mean, he seems to like the anarchic, and he describes it like that, anarchic dimension of the aesthetic regime. But as soon as one reads his descriptions, there are strict organizational principles, right? I mean, you can only combine whatever element with whatever element if you have the principle that whatever element has to be combined with whatever element, which is an organization principle. I mean, right, it discriminates from other principles of organizing material. I mean, that seems to be absolutely, even in a classic sense, normative and so forth. So what I never got in Rancière is why he makes this move that the aesthetic regime of art, which he sort of seems to be identifying with transformations proper in our understanding of art, and transformation that reach the level where we have a completely different world view, why he subtracts that, or wants to differentiate that from any kind of organization. This I find weirdly, let's put it like that, what is the I mean, I find weirdly phantasmatic, right? As if there can be just like a pure absence of any kind of structure in the, I mean, these are structure, a non-structured artwork is very hard to imagine for, again, maybe I'm too stupid, but this is what I don't get. And thus, I think at that point, Rancière becomes weirdly misleading in praising a certain kind, namely aesthetic practice, as being able to intervene, as it were, on an ontological level, which completely transforms our worldviews, but by introducing a moment of organizational anarchy. I think this is simply not true. I think it's, it's conceptually problematic, and I think it's not true. But this is why I really love this. If you don't know it, it's like 7 pages text by Lenin, Marxism and Insurrection. And he literally says, and I simplified it a lot, but he literally says that one of the greatest sentences in Marx is that one must treat insurrection as an art. And then he immediately says, well, let's be careful, because if we just, that doesn't mean l'art pour l'art, so it doesn't mean insurrection for the sake of insurrection. This is what Lenin calls Blanquism, right? I mean, people who just like to revolt everywhere in the streets and or damage shit. This is wrong, because I mean, immediately this becomes a fetishistic kind of practice. So, right, I mean, it's just like aestheticized in a bad sense. It's aestheticizing politics, aestheticizing revolutionary politics. But how to see the truly, I would say, aesthetic dimension in emancipatory political practice? How to understand that? And for Lenin, this means that that given a singular historical situation, one always needs to reflect and come up with new forms of what it means to be politically active, or of what it means to organize an insurrection. It's not like we have a kind of transcendental form of what an insurrection looks like, right? Which is transhistorical, and we simply apply it. Just like, I don't know, 7 or 700 or 7,000 people throwing stones or whatever, right? I mean, that's not true. But Lenin's point is, what is the aesthetic or artistic dimension in politics, which he thinks Marx clearly saw? It's the idea that depending on the historical situation, it is always true that one needs to reflect the very forms of insurrectional action, right? One needs to come up with new forms of collective practices. It's not enough to demonstrate, and right, the manifestations are not always enough. So, and this seems to be, this is why I started with the Rancière reference, clearly seeing that it needs to be organized. One needs formal organization, that is absolutely clear. But these formal organizations are not transhistorical or transcendental. They're not simply given, but they need to be invented. This is why I, at the end, referred to this famous Kleist essay, right? I mean, it's the making up of forms. I mean, you know that what's the perpetual formation of thoughts while speaking, right? I mean, if you don't have any idea what to say, just like start speaking, and that is the Kleistian advice, right? And some thoughts will emerge to what you're saying. Otherwise, I mean, there is no intention before. And in a sense, I read, and this is an aesthetic dimension. I mean, an aesthetic dimension because it generates new forms of appearances of collectivity and of practices and so forth. I read Lenin as a Kleistian, if you wish, right? I mean, start acting collectively and make up the forms that will renew collective practices. And there is no guarantee that this will work, right? I mean, it can just like miserably fail while acting collectively. But if you take that position, last sentence, you know at least two things for sure or for certain, namely A, that you cannot simply perform what was always performed. This was my just like sort of cheap attack on performativity theory, because I mean performative theories always assume that there is a form that can be performed, right? That's a highly metaphysical assumption. I mean, where do these forms come from if they're products of practices that are performed? Well, that's a weird explanation. So, I mean, they must be grounded somewhere else. And I think what Lenin clearly shows is one needs forms, one needs organization. Against Rancière sees that there is an aesthetic dimension, but the aesthetic dimension must be conceived. And I find Lenin, it's funny to say that out loud, but I find Lenin more convincing than Rancière. The aesthetic dimension must be conceived from within practice as an effect of practice, right? I mean, it's a practice formating, giving its own form. And what that means for the complete absence of these kinds of political practices, I mean, of course it can mean, but there is no guarantee that art can help. But I mean, right? I mean, there is the standard, at least in Germany, there is the standard. If you don't know what to do politically, just like ask the artists, right? I mean, it's their task to tell us what things will look like and so forth. And it would be lovely if they could. I mean, I wouldn't feel. I wouldn't complain. But I mean, sometimes it's just like a too easy way out to simply say, well, philosophers don't know, but the artists must know, right? I mean, that's so, yeah.
kind of reply. Because you said Marx says that an insurrection is an art, and when you don't know what to do, go ask the artists and they will tell you. But then, of course, the opposite or the reverse doesn't necessarily hold true. Artists don't go to politicians or people, at least that is frowned upon when politicians tell the artists what to do. And art is not necessarily an insurrection.
No.
Perhaps. But then perhaps you should kind of embrace this negative thing. Because here we have, you repeat Lenin and you repeat the party form and you repeat dialectical materialism. Perhaps it would be interesting at least. And wouldn't it be interesting to repeat Agi pop art? Where you precisely have this very defined relationship between politics and art. But of course not in the exact same manner as it was done in the 1920s, but where you kind of re-include dialectically everything you know in between. A suggestion.
No, I mean, just yes, not always I mean, first, it's not that easy to. I mean, again, highly metaphysical assumption. Is there always art to ask, right? I mean, right, as much as I mean, if the distinction I tried to make between Angela Merkel and real politics would hold, I mean, maybe there are no politicians, but maybe there are also no art. I mean, right? It might be. I wouldn't take that for granted. But what I wanted to say is. Of course, one needs further criteria because, I mean, just like what I said in my first answer, it doesn't hold that all signifiers that are sort of not very prominent in a certain conjuncture are per se, by not being prominent, emancipatory or can be used as having a mobilizing force for a different kind of practice. I mean, I wouldn't say that, okay, it's overly present even, but that doesn't hold for fascism or Aryanism or some. But you see, I mean, I think one needs a further criterion that there are certain signifiers which can make up that vocabulary and can contribute to a repunctualization. Others not. Why not? Yeah. Some others can, but one last remark. I actually like. I don't know if you ever saw any of his movies. Hollywood director Zack Snyder. On the first, I mean, at first sight, he makes the worst movies imaginable. He was the guy doing 300, the remake of. Dawn of the Dead, he was doing, I mean, the most recent Superman, which is called Man of Steel, Stalin, right? Batman versus Superman, all that jazz, right? But Sucker Punch, quite hard to endure, but I somehow find it amazing. I hated watching the movie, but I think it's conceptually great. But for example, this is why I'm saying that. Zizek took 300, criticized for being a chauvinist, militarist, all that movement, to be depicting the necessity of discipline for having a concept of freedom. Right? I mean, they all send their kids off to hard education somewhere in the wild where they have to fight against, after being educated and fighting against some weird animals, and only if they return, they're part of the community. And Slavoj liked that. And one can either say, well, he's not serious in that. But I mean, somehow one could say maybe that's an attempt to weirdly, heroically try to emphasize the value of discipline or something like that. Or if you want to make a conceptual point out of that, that freedom is something that needs to be attained, struggle for. You don't have it, you're not born with it, right? You need to be educated and blah, blah, blah. So maybe it doesn't. I mean, this is how I read his interpretation. It doesn't have to be simply the highest art imaginable, Maybe it's just like sometimes happening in Hollywood, right? I mean, maybe it depends then on these, yeah.
Did you want to say something too, Agon, about it?
No, the only point is the discipline. Like, where do we end up without discipline? It's you end up in these self-local organized communities, which literally, as Slava again says, failed within 2 months, or they need the state support in order to make themselves sustainable. And he takes the example of Venezuela, I think. So, how discipline, you always end up in some carnival dimension of organization, whatever it is.
We're wondering if we should propose one last question, and then we can continue in the bar after. So, I know you.
Thank you very much. I would like to go back just quick to the regarding politics and the state after Lenin. And I'm just curious, what do you think, applying the concept of a stateless state and a new party politics?
But that's practically what I mean by the party form of organization, like to turn state to turning the state working against itself, you know, like stripping it off from some power or that it has over our lives and all the rest. I know it's a very complicated question. I don't have an answer to that, but all I'm trying to say is that since state and the nation are part of capitalist form of organization, we need to move beyond that. And since some sort of liberal, or as I like to say today, neoliberal, which I don't believe it is, European Union form of organization is not sufficient. So what would take the role of this, of organizing large number of people into some sort of social life?
Yeah. And my question is actually how you would apply this concept to the crisis of European Union, for example. It's a huge question now on the left in Europe. Actually, is we are against the European state. Are they kind of transformative? Should we go in? And I just thought, is it actually realistic to say we go beyond, or is it not even more practically smart to say we take a Gramsci term, like we transform the institution? I just wonder what you think about. I feel like this idea of we just say the actually institution of the state is not the institution we can use, is a not realistic notion of politics for the left anymore. Mm-hmm. But I just wonder what you think about.
No, regarding the European Union, well, I think it's far better than the nation state's form of organization in Europe. I know it is insufficient because it doesn't take the federative aspect to a further level, and this is where my problem is with This is where I see the problem with the European Union. I think that it is caught in some self-destructive tendency. Some call it bureaucratization, some call it austerity measures. What I think is that it is striving to. I'm following again Zizek here. It is striving to find itself in the new configuration of global capitalism with China, Singapore, whatever, becoming a serious force in the global market. Can we use the European Union and transform it from within? I really don't know. I would be really happy about that. I think with regard to Greece, for instance, like I don't know what you really think about this, but neither the Lafazanis, Kouvelakis, new party, I can't remember the name, but those left nationalists which support the return to the Greek drachma and getting out of the EU, which is interestingly enough a position which Schäuble maintained during the Greek crisis, and you can read this in the Yanis Varoufakis' lost book, Adults in the Room, or something like that. Nor the position of capitulation held by Tsipras. I think, and God, this is horrible to say, but I think Varoufakis' position of remaining within the euro, not accepting the new deal, and trying to operate within the eurozone while undermining it from within, in that very specific conjuncture, was the best solution. Can we really transform the EU from within? Honestly, I don't know.
Should we end here and say we have to give a big applause to our two guests?
Thank you.
We should do it in a parliament way.
And please join us and stay.